Okay, so today we're going way back to the 60s and 70s for you, and we're talking supersonic jets, specifically a rivalry that I think a lot of people maybe haven't heard about. You always hear about the Concorde, but
Oh, yeah?
yeah, but there was another one out there, right?
Absolutely. There was a real competitor out there for the Concorde, and it came from the Soviet Union, of course, during the Cold War.
Right.
And it was called the Tupolev Tu-144, but most people know it as the Concordski.
Right, yeah, the Concordski. So, for those who maybe haven't heard of this aircraft, can you just give us like a quick rundown of what it was and why it was such a big deal?
Sure. Yeah. So basically, the Concorde was this Anglo-French project, right? You had Britain and France kind of coming together in this really unusual partnership to build this supersonic passenger jet. And of course, for you during the Cold War, that was seen as a huge technological challenge to the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And Premier Khrushchev at the time, he really wanted to make sure that the Soviets didn't fall behind in this race to develop this new kind of technology. So he basically said to the Tupolev Design Bureau, I want you to build something that's even better than the Concorde. It's got to be bigger. It's got to be faster. And
Oh,
wow, importantly, it's got to be first.
right.
And that really set the tone for the entire development of the Tu-144.
So it was all about like national pride, basically, or was
Oh, absolutely. It
yeah.
was very much, kind of a symbolic race to prove that the Soviet Union was at the forefront of technology and could rival the West in any field.
Well, and they certainly did achieve that for you, right? They managed to get this thing flying before the Concorde,
They
and
did.
yeah.
They absolutely did. And that was a huge propaganda victory for them. I mean, the Tu-144 it first flew in December of 1968, and that was 3 months ahead of the Concorde's maiden flight.
Wow.
And then they also managed to break the Mach 2 barrier first, so, flying at twice the speed of sound, again, beating the Concorde by, I think, about 4 months.
Yeah, that's pretty impressive.
It was very impressive from a just a pure performance perspective.
Yeah,
But as we'll see, that rush to be first, it may have come at a cost.
right. Yeah, it seems like maybe things weren't quite as refined, shall we say, as they could have been.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it.
So, in terms of like the actual physical airplane itself, I mean, this thing was huge, right?
It was massive. Yeah, over 215 feet long.
Wow.
And it had these four absolutely enormous engines, each one generating over 44,000 pounds of thrust.
Oh my goodness.
So you can imagine the power this thing had.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it needed all that power to reach those speeds. Mach 2.15 was its top speed.
So even faster than the
A
Concorde?
little bit faster than the Concorde, yeah.
Wow.
The Concorde topped out at about Mach 2.04, so the Tu-144 had a beat there. And it was also designed to carry more passengers than the Concorde.
Okay, so really on paper, it looked like they'd really achieved that goal of building something that was superior.
It did, it really did.
Right,
But
yeah.
but the reality was a bit more complicated.
Yeah, so one of the things that visually sets it apart, I think, from the Concorde is those canards that it had those little wings up by the cockpit.
Yeah, those are very distinctive.
Yeah, for you, what was the purpose of those?
So those canards were there to improve the aircraft's handling at low speeds.
Okay.
So, supersonic jets, they often have a bit of trouble staying stable when they're flying slowly, especially during takeoff and landing.
Oh, okay.
The Concorde actually didn't need canards. It had a different wing design that kind of achieved the same thing, but the Soviets, they went with the canards. And it seemed to work for them, at least initially.
Yeah, I guess so. But then, as we've alluded to, there are a lot of problems with the Tu-144.
They were.
Let's start with the brakes for you. I mean, it sounds like they had some serious issues with those.
Yeah, they really did. The brakes on the Tu-144, they just couldn't handle the immense heat that was generated during landing.
I mean, it makes sense,
Yeah.
right? You're coming in so fast, and
Exactly. You're coming in at these incredible speeds, and you've got this very heavy aircraft, and all that kinetic energy has to be dissipated somehow.
yeah.
And the brakes of the Tu-144, they were just not up to the task.
And so that must have been quite scary for the pilots, I imagine.
I can't imagine what that must have been like. Yeah.
Yeah, and then beyond the brakes, it sounds like the engines were also a bit of a nightmare for you.
Oh, they were known for being very temperamental. They were prone to malfunctions. They required constant maintenance.
Yeah, so not exactly reliable.
Not exactly the kind of thing you want when you're, hurtling through the air at twice the speed of sound.
Right, and then there's this weird detail, I guess, about the landing gear needing 12 wheels.
Yeah, that's a funny one.
For you, why was that?
It basically comes down to limitations in Soviet tire technology at the time, believe it or not.
Oh, wow.
They just couldn't build tires that were strong enough to support the weight of the Tu-144 with fewer wheels.
Oh, wow.
So they had to use 12 to spread the load out more evenly.
So it was really just like a brute force solution to the problem?
Yeah, pretty much.
And then maybe the biggest issue of all was the fuel efficiency or lack thereof. It sounds like this thing was a real gas guzzler.
It was absolutely notorious for burning through fuel at an alarming rate. Part of that was because it relied heavily on afterburners to achieve supersonic flight.
Right. You just explain quickly what are afterburners?
So afterburners are basically like a temporary boost of power for a jet engine. They inject extra fuel into the exhaust stream, which creates this huge increase in thrust.
Okay.
But it comes at a cost. You burn through fuel incredibly quickly.
Right. So not exactly efficient.
Not at all. And the Concorde, by comparison, the Concorde was designed to cruise at supersonic speeds without needing to constantly use afterburners.
Oh, okay. So that was one of the key differences.
That was a major difference, yeah. And it meant that the Tu-144 was not only very expensive to operate,
Yeah.
but also it had a much shorter range than the Concorde.
Got it. Okay, so all of these kind of underlying problems, I guess, kind of came to a head in a very tragic way with the crash at the Paris Air Show in 1973.
Yeah, that was a really dark day for the Tu-144 program.
Can you just set the scene? Like, what exactly happened?
Sure. So the Tu-144 was actually at the Paris Air Show in 1973 to kind of show off its capabilities.
Okay.
The Soviets were very proud of this aircraft, and they wanted to impress the world.
I mean, it makes sense they want to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the pilot that day was a very experienced test pilot named Mikhail Kozlov.
Okay.
And he was putting the aircraft through its paces, doing some high-speed maneuvers and really trying to wow the crowd.
Yeah.
But then things went wrong. The aircraft stalled at a relatively low altitude. I think it was only about 1,500 feet.
Oh, my goodness.
And it pitched over and just broke apart in midair.
That's awful.
It was absolutely devastating. All 6 crew members on board were killed.
Yeah.
And tragically, there were also 8 people on the ground who were killed as debris from the aircraft rained down on the village of Goussainville.
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, it was a really horrific accident.
And so I guess the big question then is what caused it?
Well, that's been the subject of a lot of debate over the years. Some people have pointed to pilot error as a possible factor.
Okay.
Maybe Kozlov pushed the aircraft a little too hard, or maybe he made a mistake during the maneuver.
Makes sense.
Others have suggested that there might have been some kind of structural failure with the aircraft itself. Maybe the stresses of flying at supersonic speeds were just too much for it to handle.
Right.
And then there are also these persistent rumors about a French Mirage fighter jet.
Oh, wow.
Some people believe that the Mirage was in the vicinity and that maybe it somehow interfered with the Tu-144's flight path, causing Kozlov to make a sudden maneuver that led to the stall.
Okay, yeah, I can see how that story would stir around, even if it's not necessarily true.
Yeah, it's one of those things that just kind of captures the imagination.
Right.
But the reality is that we may never know for sure what caused the Paris crash.
Yeah, it sounds like the investigation was probably pretty complicated.
It was, yeah, and the Cold War was still going on, so there was probably a lot of secrecy surrounding it as well.
Right.
But regardless of the cause, the impact of that crash was huge.
Oh, I bet.
It really tarnished the Tu-144's reputation, and it raised serious doubts about its safety.
Yeah, I mean, you can imagine how the public would react to something like that.
Absolutely.
So after this horrific incident in Paris, did they just kind of give up on the whole project, or?
No, they didn't give up immediately.
Okay.
They actually continued to develop the Tu-144, and they made a number of modifications to try to address some of the problems that had come to light.
Okay.
But then just a few years later, in 1978, there was another major crash.
Oh, wow.
This one happened during a test flight near Moscow.
For you, what happened there?
Well, this time the cause was a fuel leak that led to an in-flight fire.
Oh, my goodness.
And the crew, they actually managed to make a successful emergency landing.
Wow, that's amazing.
It was an incredible feat of airmanship, but unfortunately 2 crew members were killed in the aftermath of the crash.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, it was another terrible tragedy.
So this second crash, I mean, that must have been the final straw, right?
It pretty much was, yeah. After that, the Soviets, they finally realized that the Tu-144 was just too dangerous to continue flying.
Yeah, I mean, 2 major crashes within 5 years. That's a pretty clear sign.
It is, yeah.
So they did actually manage to get some passenger service going for a little while, right?
They did, yeah. They started flying passengers between Moscow and Almaty in 1977.
Okay, so how long did that last for you?
It didn't last long at all, only about a year and a half.
Oh, wow. So what was the passenger experience like? I mean, was it like the super luxurious thing, or was it kind of...
Not exactly luxurious.
Yeah.
The noise levels inside the cabin were absolutely deafening.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the engines were incredibly loud, and the air conditioning system, which was needed to keep the cabin cool at supersonic speeds, it
Right.
was also extremely loud.
Oh my
So
goodness.
passengers, they would actually have to pass notes to each other to communicate.
That's wild.
Yeah, it was not exactly a pleasant experience.
And then beyond just the noise, it sounds like the overall comfort was also a bit lacking.
It was, yeah, the seating was quite cramped. The amenities were unreliable. Things like the tray tables would jam, the toilets would malfunction, the window shades would keep falling down.
Oh my goodness. So it sounds like it was kind of a mess.
It was not exactly the glamorous vision of supersonic travel that people had in
Right.
mind. And on top of all that, there were still these lingering safety concerns. So it's not surprising that that passenger service was discontinued in 1982
Yeah, I guess not.
after only 55 flights.
Wow, that's really not a lot.
No, it's not.
So, we've talked a lot about the 2144 and all of its flaws and its struggles.
Right.
But I think it's important to also contrast that with the Concorde,
Yeah, absolutely.
which, obviously also had its own tragedy, but was overall much more successful.
Much more successful, yeah.
Yeah. So for you, what were some of the key differences between these two aircraft?
Well, I think one of the biggest differences was just the overall design philosophy.
Okay.
The Concorde, it was designed from the start with passenger comfort and safety as top priorities.
Yeah.
And it showed, the cabin of the Concorde was actually quite luxurious.
Okay.
It was quiet, it had comfortable seating, it had good amenities, and it was just generally a much more pleasant experience for you as a passenger.
Yeah, and it had a much longer range as well, right?
It did, yeah, because it didn't have to rely on afterburners as much as the Tu-144. It could fly much farther on a single tank of fuel.
Okay, so that makes it much more practical for you.
Much more practical, yeah.
Yeah, and then technologically, I mean, were there any key differences there?
Yeah, there were some important differences. The Concorde, it had things like carbon fiber brakes, which were much lighter and more effective at handling the heat of high-speed landings.
Oh, okay.
It also had fly-by-wire control systems, which made it much more responsive and easier for the pilots to handle.
Okay, so it was really just more advanced in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it was definitely a more refined and sophisticated aircraft.
So, obviously the Concorde also had its own tragedy with the crash in 2000,
Right?
but it still managed to fly for almost 3 decades.
It did, yeah, from 1976 to 2003.
Wow.
And it completed thousands of flights safely and reliably.
Yeah.
So, it really did prove that supersonic passenger travel could be done, and it could be done safely.
Yeah, and it really kind of captured the public's imagination in a way that the Tu-144 never did.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, the Concorde, it became this icon of luxury and glamour and technological achievement,
Right.
whereas the Tu-144 was always kind of seen as this sort of flawed and ultimately tragic experiment.
Yeah, so it's interesting to think about, these two aircraft that were developed at roughly the same time
Yeah,
with very similar goals in mind, but
right.
but they had such different outcomes.
Very different outcomes, yeah.
Yeah, so the Tu-144, it may have been a bit of a flop as a passenger jet,
It was.
but it still has this kind of interesting afterlife, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
Yeah, for you, can you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. So after its brief stint as a passenger airliner, the Tu-144 was actually used for a while for cargo flights.
Okay.
And then in the 1990s, NASA became interested in using it as a research platform.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they were working on developing a new generation of supersonic aircraft,
Okay.
and they wanted to gather data on things like aerodynamics and structural materials and handling characteristics at supersonic speeds.
Right. So it was basically like a flying laboratory for them?
Exactly.
Wow.
And so they actually leased a Tu-144 from the Russians, and they brought it over to the U.S., and they flew
Oh,
it for a number of years, conducting all sorts of experiments.
that's incredible.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic, this aircraft that was so flawed and that had been involved in these tragic accidents.
Right.
It ended up playing a role in the development of future supersonic aircraft.
Yeah, that's really cool. So, as we kind of wrap things up here for you, what are some of the key takeaways from this whole story?
Well, I think one of the biggest takeaways is that the pursuit of technological progress, it can't come at the expense of safety and reliability. The Soviets, they were so focused on being first with the Tu-144
Yeah.
that they may have overlooked some really important design considerations.
Right. And it sounds like they were under a lot of political pressure too.
Yeah, absolutely. Khrushchev, he really wanted to show the world that the Soviet Union was a technological superpower.
Yeah.
And so I think that pressure, it may have contributed to some of the shortcuts that were taken during the development process.
Right. So it's really kind of a cautionary tale in a way.
It is, yeah. I mean, it shows that you can't just rush these things.
Yeah.
You have to take the time to do it right, to make sure that the aircraft is safe and reliable and that it's going to be able to perform its mission effectively.
Yeah, and it also highlights, I think, the importance of passenger comfort and the overall passenger experience.
Absolutely. The Concorde, it proved that supersonic travel could be not only fast,
Right.
but also comfortable and enjoyable.
Yeah.
And I think that that's going to be a key factor in the success of any future supersonic passenger aircraft.
Right. So looking ahead, there are these new companies that are trying to develop supersonic jets.
Yeah.
For you, what do you think they can learn from the successes and failures of the Tu-144 and the Concorde?
Well, I think they can learn a lot. I mean, I think they can learn about the importance of thorough engineering and rigorous testing.
Right.
They can learn about the importance of fuel efficiency and noise reduction.
Yeah.
And they can learn about the importance of creating a positive passenger experience.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's a great place to leave it for you folks. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the supersonic rivalry between the Tu-144 and the Concorde.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive into history.